Students, welcome to the final video that you have to go through for this HBL. So we'll be doing Essay 5B in this particular video. So this is question 5. So as I've said, right, this question is can be quite tough to make it analytical for the students, but let's give our best shot and look at part B. Discuss the extent to which it is possible for a small and open economy such as Singapore to achieve both inclusive growth as well as sustainable growth. So this is obviously a TAS approach, you say here. So when you look at the next slide, this is what we call a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis type of question, where you need a balanced view. So you would say, okay, yes, it is possible, of course, for Singapore to achieve both. However, it can also be difficult. So it's either you may achieve inclusive growth but not sustainable, or the other way around, or it's very hard to have inclusive growth as well as sustainable growth. Then your conclusion is where you take a stand. So this is what we call a TAS approach. So now, to do well in this part, right, you have to, again, just like part A, you have to make sure you cover both sustainable growth as well as inclusive growth. And you should also be aware of some of the current policies, some of the policies that Singapore use to achieve both. Now, you guys just had an online lecture last Friday where the essay question that we went through was on the price determination question, right? On the housing market in Singapore. So if you recall that part B, right? I would advise all my students that for that particular question, right? If you're not aware of any of the current policies used in Singapore to achieve in how we handle the property market, it will be hard for you to do that question on the housing market that you went through in the online lecture last Friday. Would you agree? So just like that question, right? For this part B, right? If you're not aware of any of the current policies we use in Singapore, any policies in the past we used in the past, or any current policy that we use now to achieve inclusive and sustainable growth, my feeling is that it will be tough for you to do this question. So again, it reinforced, right? Question 4 in 2019 H2 A-level paper 2 was definitely more doable, more exam friendly for students than this particular question. So here's how I'll do it. If I'm forced to do this question, right, this is what I'll do. I will use the carbon tax when it comes to the policies that Singapore used to achieve sustainable growth. Now, if you've been reading the newspapers, right, recently, ever since I think maybe 2 years ago, but especially this year, our new finance minister, Mr. Lawrence Wong, clearly is going to push forward with this carbon tax, okay, to encourage us to uh, take note of the MEC that we impose on the rest of the world whenever we use carbon. Okay, so I'll use this when it comes to the policies, right, for sustainable growth. The advantage of doing that this will allow me to use the externality diagram for analytical depth. When it comes to inclusive growth, right, again, uh, it's good if students are aware of how the Singapore's approach towards income distribution, right, has actually changed over the years. When our first Prime Minister was Lee Kuan Yew, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, his approach towards income distribution, towards inclusive growth is very different from the current PAP's approach to income distribution. Now, so if you're aware, that'll be great. But if you're not aware of those, right? If you're not aware of those policies, and you still want to choose this question 5, I'll tell students, okay, do the best you can, stick to using terms like Gini coefficient and do the best. So here's some good awareness about the how we approach inclusive growth in the past and now. As I've said, right, our first Prime Minister was Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. When he was a prime minister, there was not that much income redistribution going on. We don't really care about that much about growth being inclusive. So if you think about it, right, think of our approach to healthcare, our 3 M's: Medisave, MediShield, MediFund, it actually sums up very well, right? Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's approach towards inclusive growth. Basically, when it comes to healthcare, right, what he sees as the ideal Singapore approach is to first, the individual himself must save for his own healthcare. That's where MediSave comes in. We force every Singaporean to have a MediSave account where we take a fraction of his monthly wages to put it into a MediSave. And if that's not enough, the next area is for the community to help him. So we used to have MediShield. The time MediShield was actually not MediShield Life, so it was not compulsory. So if MediSave, right, was not enough to take care of the individual healthcare need, the onus falls to the rest of us, the community, to pool our money together, and so that that pool of money, right, can go to people who happen to be sick at that particular time. So after he recovers, right, he will continue to contribute to the MediShield, the pool. Then the next time when another gets sick, he can then use the pool of money. So basically, we look at community if the self doesn't work. And there's a reason why we put MediFund to the end. Only when we exhaust the individual responsibility, only when we exhaust the community responsibility, then the government will come in with MediFund. So MediFund is the only is the government coming in to pay for the healthcare needs of Singaporeans who happen to be sick. So this sums up our Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's approach: self first, followed by community, then finally by government. So there was very little income redistribution going on. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew basically feel that if you are poor, if you're not doing well, okay, the fault is yours, mostly yours. But you look at now. Now, right, the approach is vastly different. Okay, the current PAP ministers, right, they are now getting more and more aware that thanks to things like international trade, thanks to globalization, the business cycles are they are getting shorter and shorter in time. In the past, right, we would have maybe 10 years of economic growth, 10 years of solid growth, followed by maybe 1 or 2 years of slight recession, okay, slowing down growth, before another 10 years of growth once again. So the business cycle was very long between the boom and the bust. But as you can see, right, thanks to international trade, thanks to globalization, the business cycle, the period of time between boom and bust is now getting very short. You might have only like 3 or 4 years of growth, followed by 1 or 2 years of uh, negative economic growth. Okay, the COVID-19 pandemic was a great example. So the business cycles are getting shorter and shorter in time. So what does this mean? This means that average Singaporean, right, his economic outcome is actually now more volatile. And sometimes when he loses his job, sometimes when his income has a sharp drop, it may not be any fault of his. Okay, this is something that the current PAP ministers are now more and more aware of. So because of that, right, because the current PAP ministers are well aware that no, you cannot really say that the person's economic outcome is his fault. It could be because of globalization. We are now introducing more and more policies, right, in order to make sure that our growth, right, our good economic growth that we achieved on the good years are redistributed, making sure that it's not just the rich that gain, but also the low-income folks. So some good examples that you can use will be the progressive wage scheme. So it used to only cover three sectors, right? The security guard sector, the security sector, the cleaning sector, as well as the landscape gardening sector. But if you have read the news recently, we are going to extend the progressive wage scheme to F&B. That will cover many more people. So the whole idea of progressive wage, right, is a sectoral minimum wage. Okay, so if you want to make more analytical depth, maybe you can draw the minimum wage graph. We are also introducing means-based testing for healthcare. So I see means-based testing as a double taxation of the rich. So when you are rich, right, if you earn a high income, not only you pay a higher income tax rate, if you opt if you are sick, right, and you opt for let's say a very uh, subsidized what class C, okay, if you're high income, right, if they discover that you're high income, the subsidy you get for selecting a class C what is actually lower than the low income. So in a sense, you are being taxed twice for being rich. First, you have to pay more income tax. Secondly, you have to pay more for the same class C one. So this is basically our policy to make sure that the growth is more inclusive. However, we are still resisting as of now to make our income tax more progressive than what it already is. We are also resisting the introduction of wealth taxes that there are some Singaporeans that are urging for it. So in this case, I'm very happy that our current finance minister and future prime minister to be, Mr. Lawrence Wong, is very much an econs trained, and so he's aware that there's some cost involved in making our income tax system overall too progressive. So instead of redistributing income so much from the rich to the poor, Singapore, right, we actually focus more on social mobility. Okay, that means we want to make sure that if you are born poor, if let's say as a kid, right, if you are born in a low income family, now our policies, right, we are not focusing so much on taxing the rich at that point of view, at that point of time, taxing the high income to straight away give to you to make you rich. No, no, no. We are trying to have policies such that over time, right, if you are born poor, can you not end up poor? That means when you give birth to your own kids, right, will your kids end up being in a higher income group than how you are born at? This is what we call social mobility. So at this point in time, I'd like to talk briefly about this chart. This chart is something that our ministers are very proud of. That what this chart basically says is, okay, it's linked to what we call, what I explained as social mobility. So if you look at the note at the bottom, right? So the question is this: if I'm born in the lowest 20% income group. So if there are five groups of the highest 20%, the next 20%, the next 20%, the next 20%, and finally the lowest 20%. So if I'm born in a family that happens to be the lowest 20% out of these five 20% groups, when I become an adult, when I reach 30 years of age, what is the possibility of someone who is born in the lowest income group as a kid, as a 1 year old, by the time he reached 30 years old and when he give birth to kids on his own, what are the chances of those kids ending up in the top 20%? Okay, so to be fair, right, every group should have the same chance when they are born to end up in the top 20%. So that would be 20% each. So in Singapore, right, someone who is born in the lowest 20% income group has a 14.3% chance of having kids that will end up being the top 20% group. So you can see it's much higher. It's twice the chance of, let's say, an American, okay, and followed by Britain, Denmark, Canada. So ours has the highest percentage chance. Okay, the fair percentage is 20%. So ours, right, 14.3% is not far away from the 20%. So this indicates a pretty good social mobility in Singapore. So we are pretty proud of this chart. Now, we have talked a lot about inclusive growth, right? What about our approach towards sustainable growth? So as I said, right, the carbon tax will be easy for students to explain well if they are forced to choose this question, because you can use the standard externality graph. And you're also aware, right, the standard evaluation is that the government may not have correct information on the exact MEC. And of course, when you raise the carbon tax, right, basically every firm and households, they use power. And you have to use carbon to a large extent to generate power, unless, of course, you want to solar power, wind power, all these things. So if the government were to impose a carbon tax to make sure that our growth is sustainable, in the short run, right, it can lead to cost push inflation. So this is the standard evaluation. Other policies that we are using recently for sustainable growth is basically to make sure that we allow the government uh, to borrow instead of trying to finance the sustainable infrastructure using taxation. This is basically to make sure that the financing of such infrastructure, they are fairer intergenerationally. Because if I were to use tax to build all these sustainable infrastructure, you are basically forcing the current generation, those that are paying the tax, to pay the cost, right? But often, right, the benefits of all these infrastructure, they will only come in the very long run. Okay, so if this current generation, they are paying for the cost, but they don't live long enough to see the benefits, to reap the benefits of the sustainable infrastructure, it's not fair for them. So here's the conclusion. Now, if you want me to take a strong conclusion, right, it's probably easier to justify that if any country, right, can ever achieve both inclusive and sustainable growth, it might just be Singapore. Okay, because you can think of it this way, Singapore has achieved economic growth, very good economic growth. We have performed very well macroeconomically since our independence. For many years, we are typically always among the list of top 5 countries in terms of GDP per capita at PPP. So we are obviously done very well. We are known as a economic miracle. Many countries are envious for our high standard of living. Our social mobility is pretty high, as I've shown you the last that picture, right? It's 14.3% for someone who is born in the lowest 20% income group to end up in the top 20% income group by the time he's aged 30 years old. So our social mobility, right, is among the highest in the world. Okay, and if you have been reading the news, our Gini coefficient after government transfer have been falling over the years. So it shows that our government is doing an active redistribution of income much more now compared to the past. And of course, now we also have policies for reducing carbon usage. So all these indicators, all these policies, right, clearly show this, that sound economic policy, even if we are small and open economy, even if we are linked to globalization, our economic fate, rise and fall, okay, sound economic policies could still be implemented to overcome the inherent vulnerabilities associated with a small and open economy. So my stand would be that, if you want to take a strong stand and justify based on what you said, right? If any countries can have both, our country will be a very good test case for it. So this would be my conclusion. So as I said, right, this essay may be a bit difficult for most students. So again, if you have a choice between question 4 and 5, you should always choose question 4. But if you're forced to do question 5, you have to address both inclusive as well as sustainable growth. And for part D, right, you have to be aware of some of the policies that we have used in Singapore in order to get the best marks for this question. So I hope you have learned very much again from these two, from the videos to tackle essay 4 and 5. Thank you for listening and have a good day.